Hello and good evening, good afternoon, good night, or good morning, whichever one you are enjoying right now. Thank you so much for tuning in again. We are talking about working memory for this unit. Very exciting unit. I may have already mentioned already that this is an area of memory that I especially love. I know I say that pretty much every unit, but my dissertation is actually related to working memory and uses a working memory task in it. And some of my current research does too. So let's get into it. I know I look especially red this evening because, I mean, my hair is always a little bit reddish or orangish. And my hoodie is orange, and also this PowerPoint is orange, and it's reflecting back onto me, so I know I look kind of wild right now. So let's get into it. So we are going to pick up a little bit where we left off in week 3 when we were talking about the different structures of memory. You may remember we talked about sensory memory and long-term memory. We're going to be talking about short-term memory, which is now kind of referred to as working memory. We're going to talk a little bit about the different components of working memory. We're going to be talking a lot about how it's used in diagnosis, and we will talk a little bit more about some alternatives to working memory that aren't just what Baddeley says. A lot of psychology is built around Baddeley's conception of working memory. I'll show you a couple of alternatives to that. And the 2 articles that we have for this week, one is going to be about Baddeley's model, and then the other one is going to be about whether or not working memory can be improved over time. And if so, how can we do that? So let's get into it. All right, so this is a quick refresher where you may remember that incoming stimuli, the first thing that we are going to experience is the sensory memory, and this is going to be the part of our memory that is going to very briefly store our perceptions. And we talked about iconic and echoic memory, or visual and auditory sensory memory, and we also talked about long-term memory, so how we were able to retrieve items from the deep storage areas of our brain. And we did talk a fair amount about short-term memory, but now we're going to kind of look at it more specifically because the last 2 units we spent a lot of time talking about long-term memory. Let's take a different look now. Okay, so this is the working memory model that Baddeley put forth. And originally it was just these 3 pieces: the central executive, the visual spatial sketchpad, and the phonological loop. And if you've taken cognitive psychology, you're probably familiar with these things already. But the visual spatial sketchpad is the idea that actually, let me back up for a second. Whenever we talk about this model, there are really 2 independent storage units, and then kind of an executive that is directing the attentional resources for those units. So we have a visual spatial sketchpad, which is going to be the storage unit that is specific for visual information, and we also have the phonological loop, which is for hearing information. We have the central executive, which is kind of like this little this is a metaphorical way to think about this, obviously, but it's kind of like the director who's going to decide, are we paying more attention to the visual things in our short-term memory or to the auditory things in our short-term memory. Several years later, Baddeley would introduce the episodic buffer, which is what we're going to be reading about for this unit. And so we'll talk more about it then. So working memory is our ability to temporarily store and manipulate items over a very short period of time. And so an example of this would be like the visual spatial sketchpad, which is going to be used for kind of trying to store visual information, which can include information about space, so like a cognitive map. It can also be remembering what someone's face looks like, or remembering a symbol or a piece of graffiti that you see on a wall. That's going to be the visual spatial sketchpad. The phonological loop is going to be a separate storage system that is going to be for verbal or auditory information, anything that we can rehearse back to ourselves. That is why it's called the loop, is because you're able to kind of say it to yourself and repeat it back to yourself. And we've already gone over a couple of examples of that already. We were talking about how short-term memory was, and we talked about the word length effect, if you remember that. And so this loop has a very finite amount of time on it, And if you're saying a phone number to yourself, 912-739-1641, 912-739-1641. That's an example of you using the phonological loop. Now, theoretically, these two units don't really interact with each other, which means that if you're trying to store information in your short-term memory, you're best at if it's one category of information that's visual and one category of information that's auditory. So in other words, you can try to remember what someone's face looks like while also trying to remember the phone number associated with that face. But if you're trying to remember what that person's name is, or if you're trying to remember two phone numbers at once, that's going to present some problems, because then you're trying to store two separate things that are both auditory or both verbal, and because of that, usually one of those pieces of information is going to be forgotten or be left out of that. So it works if you're trying to remember something visual and something auditory. If you're trying to remember multiple things that are visual or multiple things that are auditory, usually that's where you're going to experience some interference there. The central executive is kind of the controller of this, so that if we want to focus on the visual things in our short-term memory or focus on the auditory things, that is kind of what makes that decision. We'll talk more about what the implications for that are in just a moment. So I want to show you an example of working memory. I got a lot of examples for you. We'll start with the Brown-Peterson task. The Brown-Peterson task, this is a task that is before working memory was even a thing. This is something that people were doing back in the 60s as a way to test memory. And so essentially what you would do is you would give somebody a list of words to remember, and then you would ask them to count backwards from 3. So you'd give them a number like 347, then ask them to count backwards from 3. So 347, 344, 341, 338, 335, 332, and so on, while you're trying to remember that. And people will then vary the retention interval. Sometimes they will do this for a couple of minutes, sometimes for a couple of seconds, and then they ask them to recall the list of words. So based on what we know about the phonological loop, right? So remember the phonological loop, it's for verbal and auditory information. Whenever you are trying to calculate that and you are sounding it out, 330, 347, 343, 341, I did that wrong. But if you're doing that, then that's going to interfere with what you were trying to remember if you were trying to remember that list verbally. If you're trying to repeat those words to yourself, you're trying to rehearse them. But if you are trying to remember someone's face, then this task actually should not disrupt that memory. So I'm going to give you an example. So I'm going to present a list of words, but I'm going to have it here on the screen. So if you want to participate and try this out, look away, close your eyes or look away from the screen for about 20 seconds. Here we go. I'm going to read out a list of words, and I'll repeat it twice like I always do. Here we go. Publish, tube, picture, organize, constitution, prosper, young, criticism, dictionary, faint. That's publish, tube, picture, organize, constitution, prosper, young, criticism, dictionary, faint. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to repeat those back and to try to write those down, but first I want you to count down from 3s by the number 347. So I want you to do that. I'll tell you when to stop. So go ahead and give it a try. Start from 347 and count down from 3. Okay, go ahead and stop and try to recall as many words as you remember. You're not actually doing it, are you? I know you. I can see you. You're not actually doing this. So, generally what we find is that if you don't have somebody interrupt, if you just immediately are ask the participant to write down that list of words, they remember things at about 80%. But as soon as you have somebody doing the Brown-Peterson task, it drops down to about 50%, and then after a couple of seconds, it almost flatlines down at 10%. In other words, after about 12-15 seconds, or about as long as that break that I just gave you, most people are going to forget almost everything in that list with the exception of a couple of words. So that is the phonological loop. The phonological loop stores about 2 seconds of auditory information. It's that loop that we were referring to. It is sensitive to the word length effect. The longer those words are, the fewer of them we can store in that phonological loop. Alright, I'm going to skip over this next part because I was going to do this with numbers. But if you were trying to remember a list of numbers, you're generally going to do that verbally. You're going to remember it, the sound of those numbers. You're going to repeat those numbers back to yourselves. That's using the phonological loop, and you can feel it while you're doing it. While you're sounding it out to yourself, just as a reminder, that is called rehearsal, and that is also in the phonological loop. I mentioned the word length effect already earlier this semester, but in case you didn't remember, that is the idea that what we remember in the phonological loop is sensitive to the word length. So if it is a word that has multiple syllables, then we can store fewer of those in the phonological loop compared to shorter bite-sized words. Alright, I'm going to skip over this next part too instead of blanking the screen. I'm just going to fast forward to this right here because the last several units have been pushing an hour, and I want to try to get this video in shorter than an hour for your sake, because I know that the longer these videos are, the less likely people are to watch all of it. So whenever people do this task, this task from Baddeley, our good friend who kind of conceptualized working memory to begin with, he had 3 different conditions. One where it was completely quiet, one where there was instrumental music playing, and then one where there was a voice that was talking while people were trying to remember those words. And you can see pretty clearly probably what you would expect, that whenever it's really quiet, people make fewer errors than when there's instrumental music, but whenever there's a voice speaking, that's when we make the most errors of all, because that voice is going to be most similar to what you're hearing say those things, and so it's much easier for it to contaminate your phonological loop and interfere with that information. Whenever it's quiet, it's less likely for that to happen, and so we have the best performance there. That's the irrelevant speech effect. Feels a little bit like common sense, I know. Alright, so here is another example of working memory, but this time let's look at the visual component of it. So this is referred to as the visual spatial sketchpad. I always refer to it as the mind's eye, so your ability to kind of close your eyes and kind of imagine what something looks like. So I want you to follow these instructions. So it works best if you have your eyes closed. So I would ask for you to close your eyes while I read out these instructions for you. So imagine that you have a 4x4 grid. So it's you got 4 columns of 4 rows, 16 squares overall. And you have a 1. The number 1 is going to be in the second column of the second row. So now imagine those 16 squares, and you have a number 1, second column, second row. Then I want you to place a number 2 to the right of that 1. In the square above a 2, I want you to put a 3. To the right of that 3, I want you to put a 4. Below that 4, I want you to put the number 5 in that square. Below that 5, I want you to put the number 6. To the left of that 6, I want you to put the number 7. And now, what number is above that number 7? If you came up with that answer, and you correctly identified that as the number 2, then congratulations, you used the Visual Spatial Sketchpad. So in order to do this task, someone has to store this information very briefly in their mind's eye, or in the Visual Spatial Sketchpad. They came up with a 1, then you imagine a 2, then you imagine a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, and then you had to hold all of that in your short-term memory. And when I ask what number is above 7, if you were able to answer it, it's because you were storing that successfully in working memory. Now we have the third and final piece of Baddeley's model of working memory, which is the central executive. The central executive is an attentional system, and that is going to supervise and coordinate how the other 2 structures are working, or I should say modules, not structures. So if we're focusing more on the visual information or more on the auditory information. The central executive has three separate functions. First, it directs what kind of attention we're paying to that module. We're going to use it to also help us to divide our attentional resources whenever that's appropriate, and also to switch our attention whenever we need to. So basically it handles all the attentional components of this. This is part of the reason why whenever I teach cognitive psychology, this chapter, the chapters on memory, always come after the chapter on attention. So attention is a critical part to memory, and so we can even see that here with our working memory concepts. You'll also see this referred to as cognitive control or executive functioning. They're quite interchangeable in a lot of ways. So, yeah, just a reiteration of how these things fit together. The episodic buffer, as I mentioned, this was added later because most of this was conceptualized in 1974 with Baddeley and Hitch. I actually don't know what happened to Hitch, his collaborator, but it was published in a book chapter, which is kind of an unusual way for this. Usually it's, primary research articles, but this one was published in a chapter book. Okay, so I want to spend a substantial amount of time now talking about testing methods. So what are the different methods that we use to test working memory? So for trying to measure cognitive control, there's a number of ways to do that, and I know that a lot of you that are watching this are not really planning on becoming researchers or professors or whatever. Most of you are probably planning on doing mental health stuff, where you want to be a counselor, you want to be a clinician, you want to be a social worker, or something along those lines. So I want to spend some time in this chapter talking about those implications, how you could use this in counseling and stuff like that, because for like cognitive behavioral therapy, working memory is a big part of that, and like trying to diagnose and trying to measure treatment outcomes can be a part of that. All right, so researchers and clinicians like to use cognitive control as a way to measure executive functioning, and that is going to be used to talk about diagnoses for a number of different things in the DSM, including schizophrenia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, learning disabilities, PTSD, and even anxiety as well. Because people that have these diagnoses oftentimes will show impairments in these areas, or in executive functioning, which might be a hallmark of that. So just because you have an impairment in executive functioning doesn't mean that you have schizophrenia, nor does you having schizophrenia mean that you definitely have problems with cognitive control. But you can think of it as like, if you have schizophrenia, you are more at risk for having impairments in cognitive control, or if you have ADHD, you have more, you're more at risk for having deficits in working memory and things like that, or impairments in working memory. So that's why I wanted to talk about this, because working memory is used so much in diagnosing in a whole array of mental health outcomes. So, for example, you can look at these different behaviors and the different tasks that are used to study them. We're going to be talking about all of those today. So let's get into it. We're going to start by talking about the in-back task. The in-back task is a task that is going to come up in the research article for this unit about improving working memory. They use a double in-back task. And this task is used to measure how good you are at what they call maintenance. So your ability to hold things in your short-term memory. So stimuli are going to be presented one after the other, serially, and it's your job as the participant to say when the stimulus was presented. Was it one trial ago, 2 trials ago, etc.? So usually you're going to be in something like an N-2 task. And if you're in an N-2 task, which they usually call N-2, it would work like this, where I'm going to use words here. So let's say that you see the word hat. That's trial number 1. Then it goes away and you have trial number 2, and that is the word cup. And then you have trial number 3, and it's the word hat. This, you would say yes, because hat occurred 2 trials ago. Let's say the 4th trial has the word hat again. Now we would say no, because 2 trials ago was the word cup. Now let's say the next word is cup. We would say no. Let's say the next one is the word base. That's also a no. The next trial we get the word cup. We're going to say yes, because that was 2 trials ago. And let's say trial number 8 is the word base. And we would say yes there again too, because that was 2 trials ago. All right, so that's how the NBAC task works. Now people will use this as a way to measure working memory capacity, because they won't just do n-2, they can also do n-3. And if we do n-3, then let's see, would any of this change? This would be a no. So let's see, n-2 is here. Let's say this is n-3. So this would be a no, this would be a no, this would be a yes, because 3 trials ago we had the word hat. This would also be a yes, because 3 trials ago we had the word cup. That would be a no, this would be a no, the rest of these would be no's. So you can alter the parameters on that to see, and the idea is, like, if somebody can do this with NBAC-8, then they are really, really, really good at this task. They have a really good working memory. And one fun thing about this is that this has been tested in a variety of animals too, so you can look at non-human species and see how their working memory compares to ours, which is really fascinating. I had in my old lab in grad school, we had pigeons that were doing n-1, n-2, and n-4, if you can believe that. All right, so that's one way of measuring working memory. Another one is the Tower of Hanoi. And you've probably seen the Tower of Hanoi before. It's used in things like goal setting or problem solving. So both of those can be examples of working memory, because if you are trying to set a goal or achieve a goal, or to solve a problem that requires you to think ahead, then usually that's going to be involving your working memory, where you're imagining what would happen if you were to tweak some variables, what would happen to the problem then. So in this case, this is a classic problem, you've probably done it before. The objective is to move all the layers of this tower over to this post over here, but the kicker is that you can only move one of these disks at a time, and you can't let a larger disk be on top of a smaller disk. So you have to move those one by one over there. Can you do it? I would love for you to pause the video and to try to do this in your mind's eye. Try to work out, how would you get that to work? How would you move? Would you move this here, and then move this here, and then move that there? I don't know. How would you do it? The solution, and the reason why this is a little bit tricky, is because it involves you having to seemingly go backwards. And so what you're looking at right here is the way to solve it. You move the smaller disk over here, then you're going to move the middle disk over here, and then you're going to move that smaller disk back over here. And that feels wrong, right? It feels like, wait a second, they all need to be on this pole. Why do I need to move it? And then you can move the heavy one over here. Then you move the blue one back. Then you move the middle one here. Then you move the smaller one there, and then voila, you got it. Awesome. If you have a high working memory, there's a good chance that you're going to solve that faster than someone who has a shorter working memory. The Wisconsin card sorting task, this is used a lot for executive functioning as well. I've seen it used a lot with people who have schizophrenia, actually. The Wisconsin card sorting task is pretty straightforward and simple. All you got to do is decide what is the rule that is organizing these cards. So, for example, if you see these cards, you would learn to put this card there, because you're looking at just blue shapes. If you are looking at this, then you would probably submit the yellow for the same reason, that they're all the same color. But they don't always have to be the same color. So for example, if I'm looking at this, then maybe you would sort only circles over here. Or if you're looking at this, then it's only squares. Or over here, it's only triangles, and so on and so forth. So you're sorting by color, or you're sorting by shape, or you're going to sort by how many number or how many shapes are present on that. So basically, every time you establish the rule, the experimenter is then going to change it and try to get you to organize them differently. And it's your job to try to figure out what is the rule that at play here. Do you sort by color? Do you sort by shape? Do you sort by quantity? Those that have impairments in working memory generally are going to have a hard time with this, especially problems with their central executive, because they can't disengage from the first rule. They get stuck on the first rule, and they continue doing that longer than other folks do. Here is the Stroop task. This is a pretty popular one you may have seen before in Psych 101. The goal here is that you're supposed to say what the colors are of these words. So say it as fast as you can, and yes, you will need to say this out loud. It works way less if you try to say it mentally. So try to say this out loud. What do we got here? Black, green, red, blue, yellow, green, blue, black, red, yellow. Awesome, cool. Now, if you get the second column, now try to say these colors. Yellow, red, green, yellow, blue, red, black, green, red, blue. So I could say it, I got them all right, but I definitely felt slower that time around. This is a very old task published by a guy whose last name was Stroop in 1932, so well before cognitive psychology was around. And what they found is that whenever people are responding to these nonsense words, people are really fast at that. But when they are responding, when the words are equivalent to the colors, people are also really fast. So if this was the word black, if this was the word green, if this was the word red, if this was the word blue, but people slow down whenever the words are not the same as the colors, which is what you see here in column B. So that is that is a problem with the central executive, right? If the central executive is supposed to help us ignore irrelevant stimuli or divert our attention to only the important information, then you need the central executive to do that for column B, for this column right here. All right, so this does bring up an issue though, which is that is intelligence and cognitive control the same thing, or is working memory and intelligence the same thing? And I would invite you to kind of think about this critically and skeptically. So is it possible to have a really high working memory but very poor intelligence? So could somebody be really good at those tasks but have very poor intelligence? I don't know. Do you think the opposite would be true? Do you think that somebody could have really poor cognitive control but really high intelligence? So in other words, could somebody bomb all of those tasks that we just did and have really high intelligence? I think so, right? So the question is, to what degree do these constructs overlap with one another? And what they have in common is that, sorry, I dropped my stylus. What they have in common is this third variable, which is attention. So when we talk about working memory, we have to really be careful about how we're talking about measuring it, because some really smart people have emphasized this and made a career out of challenging this notion that attention is necessary for working memory, that you can't really do a working memory task without attention. So if somebody was really good at paying attention, then they would probably score better than average on a working memory task and better than average on a standard intelligence test. If somebody has a really low attention, then they're probably going to score low on working memory and also lower than average on intelligence measures. But if somebody's feeling a little bit offended right now, that's okay, because what I'm saying is that just because you have a low attention span doesn't mean that you have a low intelligence. It just means that when we traditionally study intelligence, what we're also studying there is the ability for people to pay attention, which is different than intelligence, right? So whenever we're doing any of these tasks, I want you to think critically and skeptically. Is this actually studying memory, or is this also studying attention, and to what degree can those things be different? All right, so let's change things up here. We're at the 30-minute mark, so let's change things up to talk about how we can use this to diagnose folks with DSM diagnoses. So let's take a quick look. So working memory measures can tell us all sorts of things about an individual's cognitive profile, let's say. One of the examples I already gave you was schizophrenia, right? With the Wisconsin card sorting task, if somebody bombs that and they're having issues with it, it means that that's one of the symptoms, of schizophrenia, is that they have issues with disengaging from stimuli. So we can have, if we suspect that someone's having issues with depression, for example, we might pick a working memory task to give them to look at whether or not that is also impacted, in addition to the normal things. So your Beck Depression Inventory or your self-report scales, your clinical interviews. So these are not, please don't think of this as like an exclusive, like if you don't do well on this, it means you have schizophrenia or whatever. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. This is like one of many tools that cognitive behavioral therapists will use to aid with the diagnosis. So what we're looking at right here is a digit span task. So which we talked about earlier this semester. We haven't talked so much about it right here. But this is looking at people who just have to recall a series of numbers that they remembered. So when they recall it forward versus when they recall it backwards. And what you're seeing here isn't a huge difference, but what we're seeing is that, yes, people do get worse when they recall it in reverse. So they drop about 3 items. But that people that have schizophrenia are on average about 2 items worse with the digit span task compared to neurotypical subjects. And like I mentioned, we can also see this in depression, that if we're looking at people who are doing a working memory task, in here they were doing an NBAC task, what they found is that people who were depressed showed less activation in the prefrontal cortex, which is what you're seeing right here. You see all those blues, and more activation in the left occipital lobe, which you have right there. You see some less activation over here too, prefrontal cortex, but also looks like the parietal lobe as well. So the whole reason why people are fascinated by this, and right now there truly is like a scramble to try to study this stuff, a race for it, is because people are trying to find diagnostic biomarkers. What is a diagnostic biomarker? Basically, it means that kind of one of the things that the National Institute of Health, the Natural Science Foundation are trying to fund to try to understand is, can we diagnose folks by looking at their brains? Can we scan somebody in an MRI scanner while they're doing some task and then look at that result and then draw a conclusion about the diagnosis here? This is a really touchy subject as well. People argue about this stuff a lot. And I think that, so my spouse, for example, she does a lot of PET imaging research. She doesn't do working memory stuff, but she's interested in trauma, she's interested in borderline personality disorder, and whether or not you can scan somebody using a PET scanner and come to the conclusion about that person is more likely or less likely to have experienced trauma or to have borderline personality disorder. But even though that is the work that she does, she will absolutely stress that she doesn't think it's going to be possible to just throw somebody into a scanner and just use the findings from the scanner to make that diagnosis. Think of this as one of the tools in your tool belt. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's one of many tools that we might use to help our clients. All right, so let's take a quick look at some ways that we can. I'm going to show you a hands-on example in just a moment. So looking at how trauma and cognitive control and working memory kind of intersect, trauma and phobias usually will have show deficits in working memory, but they only show deficits when the stimulus is relevant to their phobia or their trauma. And this you would expect, right? And that's because whenever traumatic memory is triggered, usually that results in problems with attention, because either that individual can't stop focusing on that triggering stimulus, or they are trying to think about something else desperately so that they don't have to engage with that stimulus. And the same thing is true for phobias as well, as you might expect. That whenever something that you are really afraid of is present in the room with you, there's a good chance that you're either going to focus directly on it or you're going to try to get away from it. So let's take a look at a change detection example, and I'm so excited to do this because we've learned about change detection already this semester, and so we can kind of see how this is used to study working memory. So here is kind of the theory behind this. This is what informs what I'm going to show you. The idea is that if we experience trauma, then yes, that is going to affect our learning associations, but that's also going to affect how we allocate our resources. And it's going to do that in 3 different ways. One is that can result in hyperarousal. In other words, whenever someone is around something that is traumatic, it is going to overstimulate them so that usually their mind is racing and their attention is all over the place. Maybe they can't stop focusing on something now. Or we can have the direct opposite, which is that it results in avoidance. So attention towards that object is reduced. Or it can result in a little bit of both, where now that individual is experiencing sometimes enhanced attention, but other times decreased, and it flickers back and forth, which causes a lot of stress and also causes decreased accuracy over the span of a session. All right, so here is a change detection example. Maybe you remember change detection, right? It's whenever I'm going to change something on this screen, I want you to try to identify what it is. All right, so I'm putting up that mask. All right, so let me know if you can see the thing that is changing between these pictures. All right, do you see it yet? It is this thing right here. Is that fake Livestrong bracelet that you can now see that I clearly drew on there using Microsoft Paint. All right, so that is the stimulus. Now, maybe you saw it. Some people do, but it usually takes a couple of tries for people to get it. And in that case, this is not something that is usually relevant to someone's phobia or relevant to someone's trauma. Livestrong bracelets are, and so for that reason, this is not something that people generally are going to notice. But let me show you a different example. All right. So here we have a picture of Westfield State University. It's in front of the dining commons with a little bit of a dated sign that they have here. This is just the best one that I could find of the DC in front of Westfield with people in it. All right, so you see this image. I'm going to take it away, do the same thing. So let me know if you see the stimulus. What has changed between these pictures? Alright, do you see it yet? It is our friend the spider right here. So the spider was what's flickering on and off. And now that you know it, you can throw your attention right there and you can see it very easily, right? And I know, I made it a little hard because I kind of put it off to the side right there, but that's okay. Alright, so in this study, which was published in 2006, basically what they found is that in a change detection task like this, that whenever the changing object was not related to that individual's fear, that basically we're going to have pretty much a flat line between spider-phobic individuals and non-spider-phobic individuals. However, whenever we do see something that is spider-related, like you saw just there, that people that have a spider phobia reported it took them longer for them to be able to see what it was. So, right, we got the number. Oh, sorry. Actually, as I was explaining that, I was like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. They actually detected it faster overall, and were able to spot more of them. What you're looking at right here is the total number of detected changes, and we can see a pretty sizable drop, right? So going from about 15.5 changes to about 13 changes. So people that were spider phobics were better able to detect the change when it was spider related. When it was spider unrelated, we still see an increase here, which is really interesting. Maybe that tells us something about our innate fear of spiders, but not as much as the difference between that for spider phobics. All right, so here is another example. This is using an attentional blink task. So I want you to take a look at this image. In just a moment, I'm going to show you a series of images that are going to go in very quick succession, and I want you to try to find this image. Here we go. All right, maybe it happened so fast you missed it. I'm going to do it one more time. Here we go. Oops, sorry. Okay, that time I saw it. So most people are going to see that image. However, people that have a history of domestic assault may not have seen that image. Why not? Because that image came right after this traumatic image that depicts a scene of domestic violence. Now, I know this looks like a very fake staged photograph, because it is, but for folks that have experiences with domestic violence like this, as you might imagine, could be a very triggering or very highly sensitive image, and for that reason, they can't disengage from it. And so, this image of the rotated city line is not going to be seen because people can't disengage from that stimulus. Let's do this one more time. Here we go. All right, so in that case, people will say that they saw the target because, they would see the target if this common item was presented in front of it. So if the common item was presented in front, then they would see the target, but because we have this threatening stimulus here, people will generally miss that target. That's referred to as the attentional blink, and that's why it's called the attentional blink task. And you can see the results here that when we have people who are not sensitive to domestic violence, we don't really see a difference between the neutral or the negative. But when we have people that are sensitive to that domestic violence, we do see quite a big difference, where it moves from that they see it only about 3/4 of the time to seeing it almost all the time. All right, so people less sensitive to emotionally charged stimuli are going to see the target regardless of if it followed the negative image or not. Those that are sensitive to it might miss it. All right, and then the last one of these that I want to show you is the free viewing task. And the free viewing task is usually used with eye tracking technology, which is something that we do have here at Westfield. And the idea is that you put somebody in front of a computer and you show them on the monitor a series of images, and using this eye tracking toolbar, it tracks where their eyes are, where they're looking, how wide their pupils are, and things like that. And so the idea is that the wider someone's pupil, the more stressed out they are, and that's a physiological reaction. If somebody is stressed, their pupils get larger. If somebody is feeling relaxed, their pupils get a little bit smaller. The reason for that is, like I said, it's a physiological thing. It's the somatic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is going to handle a lot of the fight or flight responses, and the idea is that if you are in a fight or flight mode, your pupils are going to expand so you can let in as much visual information as you possibly can. So this example that I'm going to show you here was from this 2010 article that was looking at Iraqi war veterans whenever they were presented with a couple of different kinds of images, trauma-related images or neutral-related images. So the questions are, where did veterans look first and how long did they look? And so here we got these two images, and yes, you might expect that somebody that has no history with war or with combat or military-related violence, that they may look equally at both of these stimuli. But somebody that has experience or trauma stemming from that are going to have differences. But some folks might focus more on this stimulus, which is clearly taken in the Middle East. You can tell from the service members back there. Or maybe they have trauma and they will focus exclusively on this because they don't want to look at that, which would be avoidance. So in that case, what we see here is that for folks that don't have, folks that are looking at the neutral stimuli, with this is PTSD negative, the solid line is. So we see that they look at the traumatic a little bit less than the folks that do have a PTSD diagnosis, and the people that have a PTSD diagnosis are going to look at the neutral stimulus for less time than those that have no PTSD diagnosis. And we also see changes in their pupils as well. So those that are in the PTSD positive diagnosis, we see that for the traumatic images that their pupils are expanded compared to folks that don't have a PTSD diagnosis. All right. So a couple of other things that we can look at here. Learning disabilities. This is also one of the things that people that have learning disabilities, it may be because they have a deficit in their working memory, which is very common actually. If you've ever taken anything like the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, you've probably done some of these tasks before because they're very common and they measure a whole host of things. So for example, if you have dyslexia, that is considered a reading processing disorder. So it's an impairment with your ability to read, but not an impairment to your intelligence. And so all that I'm trying to say here is that none of this has any bearing on intelligence. It just has very hyper-specific impacts on things related to working memory. So some of these learning impairments can affect working memory, which is why oftentimes if you take the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, you may see something like this, where they will report a full-scale IQ to you, but more importantly, they're going to give you these subscales that measure your verbal IQ and your performance IQ. So verbal IQ is going to be for verbal things like your vocabulary, how well you comprehend information, how well you can make analogies and similarities. And it also looks at your working memory index, which is going to include your ability to do mental math, your ability to do the digit span task, where you are, trying to remember a list of numbers, or the number sequencing, which I'll go into in just a moment. So, and again, this shows that, whenever we think that we're studying intelligence, we're also studying working memory, and that actually those things probably should be separated and are not considered the same thing. All right. So here is an example of a working memory task according to the WAIS. So if I were to ask you which 3 of these pieces go together to make this puzzle, you could study this image and then you can tell me which it is. I think it is going to be, which 3 images? It's going to be, I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I think it's going to be this. Oh, maybe not. I gotta think about this. I think I got that wrong. How embarrassing, I'm recording this. But you'll be able to put 3 pieces together and, yeah, I gotta think about this, and I feel like I'm on the spot now. Maybe I have an impairment in my working memory, in which case I'm not ashamed of that at all. Another one is gonna be the figure weights question, where if you look at this and you look at this, try now to tell me what would you need to balance the scales if this is on one end. And so the way that you would do that is you would have to, using your working memory, come to conclusion like, okay, one green pentagon is worth 2 of these stars. And if that's the case, then that means that over here we have like a half of a green pentagon, right? And that a half green pentagon plus a purple plus a blue are going to be equal to 1 red and 1 purple. And so then you can try to work out the problem from there and try to imagine, well, what could be right here. I think I spotted the answer. I could be wrong. I'm probably wrong. I think, I'm pretty confident actually, that this is the answer, that 3 is the answer. Check my math on that, let me know. Here we have cancellation, and cancellation is going to seem pretty straightforward, but all you have to do is to draw a line that goes through each red square and through each yellow triangle. So as you're going through this, you're not going to do this one, but you will do this one. You're not going to do this one, but you're not going to do that one. You're not going to do that one. You're not going to do that one, but you will do that one. So if we move down here, no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes, no, no, etc., etc. And it goes on for a full page doing that. And then finally we got the digit span. I've already mentioned this. So the digit span task is like, if I give you this number 912739 and I ask you to recall it in forward sequence, then you would say 912739. If I asked you to do it in reverse, then you would say, that's 937219. And I could also make this a huge pain in the butt by giving you this instead, 9A27B. Actually, no. Let's do QS. No, QL. And if I ask you to do this in an ordered position, then you're going to do the alphabet first and then numerical order first. So the answer here would be ALQ279. That would be how you answer that. Very hard doing that off the top of your head while remembering those things. All right, so those were some of the different kinds of working memory tasks that are used to try to get at learning disabilities or schizophrenia or trauma or depression. Now I want to switch up gears to end this unit by talking about some of the alternatives to Baddeley. And I've actually kind of mentioned these a little bit in some of the previous units. So Cowan, and a lot of these actually kind of happened in the 90s, because the 90s is where people were really challenging Baddeley's work, which is why he, in the year 2000, tried to update his model, and that is one of the articles that we're going to be reading for this unit. So we got Nelson Cowan. Nelson Cowan, he is a researcher. Actually, I think he just retired. So he was a researcher who put this working memory model forward. So it's not that we have, these 3 pieces, the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad and the central executive. Instead, what he argues is that we do have a central executive. We do have something that helps us draw attention to things in our short-term memory. But that short-term memory was best thought of as currently activated long-term memories. So if we focus our attention on some part of our long-term memory, it will be activated. And that activation is our short-term memory. So here he's trying to kind of make this into a more broad, neuro-based kind of model by thinking about and trying to incorporate long-term memory, short-term memory, and attention into one coherent construct. So according to him, short-term memory and working memory, same thing, are just activated long-term memories. So if I ask you, what'd you have for breakfast, and you're imagining what you have for breakfast, that is because your long-term memory was activated and it is now in your short-term memory. And then in that way, attention works like a spotlight. Here is maybe my favorite of these alternatives, which is Brian Posel, his what he calls emergent property model of working memory. And his view is that working memory is an emergent property of the nervous system. If you're not familiar with this phrase, emergent property, it comes to us from physics and chemistry. And the idea is that there are some things that when you try to reduce them to their smaller individual features, it doesn't work. It only works whenever you have a few key ingredients together that when they interact, it creates something new and novel. And his argument was that the nervous system is made up of these separate components of the brain. And when those components are activated, that is what gives us working memory. And so he based this more on kind of neuroimaging data that he had kind of seen throughout the years, more so than any kind of behavioral data, which is part of the reason why I like it, actually. And so in this way, he kind of visualizes the brain, or working memory I should say, as a series of really short memory centers that are more akin to sensory memory than to what George Miller was talking about when he's talking about 7 plus or minus 2. So basically we have these small units all throughout the brain that store things, and that these can be highly specialized. According to him, we have a working memory for pitch, we have a working memory for color, we have a working memory for faces, we have a working memory for words, and all of these different kind of facets, and that these things work together because of how our prefrontal cortex distributes attention. So for him, for Posel and his theory, the prefrontal cortex is kind of working like the central executive, where it's going to kind of pick which networks we're paying attention to. So this network, we're going to pay more attention to it because it's more active, and it's the one that helps us focus on faces. Or this one that helps us focus on pitches and music and things like that. And then finally we have Kane and Engel. Kane and Engel are some researchers from Georgia Tech, and their whole idea was very similar to one of the ideas that I talked about earlier, which is that working memory is just a kind of a combination of attention and intelligence. That whenever we're talking about working memory, what we're talking about is our ability to focus attention and our ability to reasonably react to those things. So their whole thought experiment was, is it possible to have a high working memory but low attention? And their answer was probably not. And then, is it possible to have a high working memory but low intelligence? And their answer again was probably not. And this is part of the reason why we have such a high correlation with working memory tasks, like the O-SPAN task, with other measurements of intelligence, like the IQ test or Raven's fluid intelligence. Raven's fluid intelligence is actually going to show up in our working memory article, the one about improving working memory, because they're gonna try to make the argument that working memory and intelligence, or fluid intelligence, our ability to think on our feet, which is what fluid intelligence is different from crystallized intelligence, which is intelligence for like trivia and things you learn in books. Fluid intelligence is like street smarts. It's like your ability to think on your feet and adapt to new situations. But their whole claim, their idea, their theory, is that because working memory tasks require attention, that it's so hard for us to actually measure working memory without measuring attention at all. And so their version of working memory really stresses the importance of the kinds of tasks that you're using. That whenever you're using a working memory task, you need to really be critical about, is this actually an attention task or is this a working memory task? And then this brings us finally to Baddeley, who updated his model to include the episodic buffer. I'm not going to talk too much about the episodic buffer because we're going to read a whole article about it. But the idea behind it is that he introduced this new component of working memory, referred to as the episodic buffer, which is going to help us transfer information from long-term memory into working memory, but also help us kind of store visual information as verbal and verbal information as visual. So it helps these independent structures communicate with each other, which is why whenever we go all the way back here, we can see that the episodic buffer is going to also interact with long-term memory, so that if we're trying to encode something visually, but we hear it, that we can hear it, and then it's going to come through over here, essentially. All right, so thank you so much for tuning in. I know that, and I tried to keep this at just an hour. I know this was a lot of information, and I went a little bit fast through some of this stuff. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I would love to talk about this stuff. I had to restrain myself to not work in some of my dissertation data on this. So, normally at the very end here, I like to share with you something. I don't think I have shared my buddy Fozzie with me. And you can see he's asleep over there, so I'm going to go get him. I think I've shown you Hopper. He's sleeping under the desk here. But I didn't get Fozzie, so give me one quick moment, and I'm going to go get him. Hey, Fozzie. Hey, bud. I know you're sleeping. I know you're sleeping. Look at this good boy. Look at this good boy who's been sleeping. Oh boy. So this is Fozzie. He's our middlest dog. He's about 6 years old. I think he's ready to go back to sleep. He doesn't like that I've woken him up. But this is my loyal, my wife calls him my shadow. Not because he is very dark, but because he follows me around everywhere. He's super friendly, super loyal, and would do anything for me. And I would do anything for him. He's my buddy. Thank you. Sorry about that. You can go back to sleep now. All right, and now he's gonna interact with me and probably wonder what he can do to help. All right, and you can see Hopper. He's now stretching and doing his thing too. All right, thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.